He dug for water, but found the heart of an Apache widow. He was not a young man, but neither was he old. His face carried lines, not from age alone, but from years of quiet suffering, of mistakes he could never quite undo, and losses that weighed heavily on his heart. Every step he took seemed louder than the last, echoing off the empty buildings, as if the town itself wanted him to notice it. He had left his life far behind, in a city that felt like a cage. The people he once knew had tried to understand him, but grief is a lonely burden, and he had carried it alone. Nights of silence, long days of regret, and a feeling that life had betrayed him had driven him to leave everything familiar. He did not have a clear plan, only a desperate need to find somewhere quiet, somewhere he could start again without being haunted by his own memories. The town he arrived in was almost forgotten. Its streets were lined with old wooden houses, some leaning, some with windows darkened by dust. A few shops stood stubbornly open, offering basic supplies and goods that no one seemed eager to buy. The wind blew dry leaves and sand across the roads, and a few old men sat on benches, watching strangers pass by with careful eyes. Life moved slowly here, slower than anywhere he had known, and yet the man felt a strange peace in that slowness. For the first time in many years, he could hear himself think. He had come for work, any work that would keep him busy and allow him to survive. Digging wells had always been part of his family's history, something his father and grandfather had done in faraway villages. The labor was hard, often thankless, but it demanded honesty, patience, and strength. And strength, he realized, was something he needed more than anything. Not the strength to fight, but the strength to endure, to keep moving even when the ground beneath him seemed unyielding, just as life had. The first few days were harder than he had imagined. The sun burned fiercely, leaving no corner of his skin untouched. The soil was tough, dry and stubborn, full of rocks and roots that refused to break under his spade. His hands blistered, his muscles ached, and each swing of the tool reminded him of the years he had wasted doing nothing but thinking and remembering. Yet with every shovelful of earth he removed, he felt a tiny victory, a reminder that he could still work, still live, and still carve out something meaningful from the harshness of life. Locals watched him with interest but remained distant. They were a quiet people, used to strangers passing through without leaving a mark. A few nodded as he passed by, a brief smile here or there, but no one invited him in. It did not bother him. He had not come for friendship. He had come for something simpler, a chance to keep going, to dig into the ground and maybe, if he was lucky, dig into himself. One morning, as he was surveying the land for a new well, he noticed a figure moving slowly across a distant ridge. She was alone, carrying a small bundle, her steps deliberate, her posture straight despite the weight she carried. She seemed to belong to the land in a way he did not yet understand. Her presence was quiet but commanding, like a force that had grown from the very soil she walked upon. Curious, he watched her, and something inside him stirred, a feeling he had not felt in a long time, a mix of curiosity, respect, and an inexplicable pull towards someone he had never met. It was the widow, as the townspeople later told him. She lived alone on land that had been in her family for generations. Her husband had passed many years ago, and she had learned to survive through resilience, patience, and a deep understanding of the desert. People spoke of her with a mix of admiration and caution. She was strong, independent, and careful with her heart. She had known love and loss, joy and sorrow, and the land itself seemed to hold her stories within its red soil. When they met, their conversation was brief, measured. She did not smile easily, and he did not speak more than necessary. He asked about the well she needed, and she explained what the land required: careful digging, patience, and respect. The task seemed simple at first, yet he sensed a deeper significance, something beyond the physical labor. Every action here mattered, every movement was watched, and every mistake was remembered by the land and by her. The man began digging where she had instructed, slowly at first, testing the soil, understanding its rhythm. The work was grueling, the sun relentless, yet there was a strange satisfaction in the toil. With each shovelful of earth removed, he felt a connection to something larger than himself, something both humbling and healing. The labor became a meditation, each movement a way to release grief and slowly reclaim his sense of purpose. Days turned into weeks. The widow visited occasionally, observing his progress from a distance, offering advice or a quiet word when needed. Their relationship grew silently, built on shared effort rather than conversation. She taught him to notice the small things, the smell of rain before it falls, the sound of the wind through the canyon, the way the soil shifts when water is near. He listened, learned, and began to understand that the land, much like the human heart, holds memory, pain, and resilience. In these days of labor, the man confronted his own history. Memories came uninvited, faces of those he had lost, mistakes he had made, moments of kindness he had ignored. Yet, instead of overwhelming him, these memories became tools, reminders of why he had come here. He was digging not just for water, but for clarity, for a chance to face himself without distraction. Each spade of soil removed became a small act of courage, a step toward acceptance, a way to honor both loss and hope. The desert was not easy. Nights were cold, the wind biting at exposed skin. He slept in a small tent, listening to the vast silence around him. Sometimes he thought of leaving, of returning to the world he had abandoned. But each morning he rose, drawn back to the earth, to the task, and to the quiet presence of the widow whose strength inspired him more than he could say. In that quiet, unassuming way, he began to heal. By the end of his first month, he was no longer just a man working for survival. He had become part of the land's rhythm, learning its lessons and discovering the strength that comes from patience, humility, and honest labor. The desert, once intimidating and lifeless, had begun to speak to him in whispers of hope. And in those whispers, he found the first spark of a life that could, perhaps, be rebuilt. Though he had arrived seeking only work, he realized he had stumbled upon something more profound. A connection not just to the land, but to its people, its stories, and perhaps, in time, to the heart of a woman who had endured as much as he had, though in different ways. The well was not yet finished, and neither was he. But for the first time in many years, he felt that life was not something he had to run from. It was something he could meet, one careful step, one shovelful of earth at a time. The man's days were long, filled with the rhythm of digging, lifting, and clearing the dry, stubborn soil. Yet even as his body grew stronger and his hands tougher, he could not stop thinking about the woman he had seen walking across the ridge. There was something in her movements, calm, deliberate, as if every step had purpose, that left a quiet impression on him. Unlike the townspeople, who kept to themselves, she seemed alive in a way that belonged entirely to the desert. He first saw her up close one morning when he carried his tools past the edge of her property. She was tending a small garden, the green shoots standing in sharp contrast to the surrounding red soil. Her movements were careful, almost ceremonial, as she checked the plants, brushed away dust, and watered them with a gentle hand. She glanced up at him but said nothing, her eyes steady and observing. There was no curiosity, no judgment, only a quiet acknowledgement of his presence. For the first time in weeks, he felt both nervous and drawn in. He wanted to speak, to introduce himself properly, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he nodded and continued on his way, hoping she would understand his respect. In that nod, there was an unspoken understanding. They were both strangers to each other, yet both connected to the land in ways that words could not fully capture. The widow's life was not easy. Her husband had died many years before, leaving her to manage the land alone. She rose early each day, tending to the soil, preparing meals, and maintaining the small homestead with a quiet determination. She knew the land intimately, the way it held water beneath its surface, how the soil shifted in storms, and how the wind carried both news and memory. Her days were filled with work that demanded both patience and strength, and yet she found moments of peace in the simplicity of her routines. When the man approached her one afternoon, carrying a small sack of tools she had requested, she studied him with careful eyes. There was a hesitance in her, a wall built from years of solitude and loss. She asked him questions about his experience, his skills, and his intentions. His answers were honest but brief, revealing a man who had seen hardship, who understood toil, and who carried grief quietly in his heart. The widow listened, her silence measuring his sincerity more than any words could. Over the following days, their interactions grew slowly. She would watch from a distance as he worked, occasionally offering advice or correcting a technique, never harshly, always with respect. He began to understand that her guidance was more than instruction, it was a form of trust. By showing him how to read the land, she was sharing a part of herself, a way of life that had been forged through years of struggle and resilience. Each lesson was small but meaningful. How to feel the moisture in the soil, how to detect the presence of rocks before striking them, and how to conserve energy while working under the sun's relentless heat. The man began to notice details about her life, details she did not speak aloud but that the land revealed. The garden was tended with care, each plant thriving despite the harsh conditions. Her home, though simple, was tidy and organized, evidence of a person who valued order and respect in a world that often offered neither. He observed how she moved through her days, carrying herself with quiet dignity, never seeking attention, yet commanding respect by her very presence. As the sun dipped below the horizon each evening, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, they would sometimes sit a few feet apart, sharing the quiet. No words were needed. The silence was comfortable, almost companionable. In that silence, the man felt something he had not felt in years, a sense of belonging, even if only fleeting. The widow, too, seemed to acknowledge his presence as part of the rhythm of her life. She did not ask questions, and he did not offer explanations. They simply existed alongside each other, their lives intersecting in the shared space of work, effort, and observation. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting morning of digging, the widow approached him with a small jar of water and a piece of bread. The gesture was simple, almost casual, but it carried weight. She did not offer sympathy, only practicality and care. He accepted it with gratitude, noticing for the first time the warmth behind her eyes, the subtle kindness that she had not yet revealed. The moment was small, yet it lingered in his mind, a reminder that connection could grow quietly, without words or grand gestures. Through their growing familiarity, he began to learn more about her past. She had lost her husband to illness, a cruel and sudden departure that left her alone in the vast desert. Her grief had been private, a river that flowed silently beneath the surface of her life. She had learned to carry it without complaint, finding strength in routine in the land and in the small joys of daily existence. He listened without pressing, aware that trust was not given freely, but earned through time, respect, and patience. The man also shared pieces of his own story, though sparingly. He spoke of a city left behind, of family ties strained by loss, and of the loneliness that had driven him to this desert. He did not seek sympathy, only understanding, and he found it in her quiet presence. She did not offer advice or judgment, only a listening ear and a shared space where grief and effort could coexist. In those moments, a bond began to form, one that transcended words, rooted instead in shared experience, work, and a mutual understanding of loss. Their work on the well continued, each day bringing new challenges and lessons. The soil was stubborn, the heat relentless, and progress slow. Yet, with every spadeful of earth removed, they grew more attuned to each other's rhythms and the land itself. He began to anticipate her advice. She began to trust his judgment, and together, they navigated the difficulties of the task with a quiet harmony. The work became a bridge between them, a shared purpose that allowed them to connect without forcing conversation or emotion. As the days passed, the man began to notice the small ways she expressed care. She would leave food for him to find, refill his water jug without comment, and offer a steady hand when he struggled with a particularly difficult section of the well. Her gestures were never extravagant, never dramatic, but they carried meaning far beyond their simplicity. He realized that she had her own ways of showing connection, shaped by a life of self-reliance and resilience, and that these gestures were gifts of trust and recognition. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky turned shades of purple and gold, they sat together near the half-dug well, watching the shadows lengthen across the desert. The man felt a quiet sense of peace he had not known in years, a sense that life, even with its hardships and pain, could offer moments of beauty and connection. The widow, too, seemed to acknowledge this shared understanding, her posture relaxed, her eyes calm, reflecting the fading light of the day. In those quiet moments, he realized that the desert had given him more than work and solitude. It had given him insight, perspective, and a connection to a woman whose strength and resilience mirrored his own. He understood that healing was not a sudden event but a gradual process, shaped by effort, observation, and the quiet bonds that form when two people share space, labor, and understanding. The widow, for her part, began to see the man differently. He was not just a stranger, not just a worker who arrived with tools and determination. He was someone who carried grief and loss like she did, someone who had come seeking purpose and found it, at least in part, through honest work. She respected his effort, his patience, and the quiet integrity with which he approached the land and the task. In a world that often judged too quickly, she recognized in him a kindred spirit, someone who could understand without needing to speak, who could endure without complaint. By the end of this second part of their journey, the foundation of a unique relationship had been laid. It was not yet romance, nor was it friendship in the conventional sense. It was something quieter, deeper, and more enduring, a connection built on mutual respect, shared labor, and the recognition of each other's strength and resilience. The desert, once intimidating and solitary, had become a space where trust and understanding could grow, slowly and steadily, like water seeping into dry soil. Though the well was far from finished, and their lives remained full of challenges, both the man and the widow began to sense that something profound was unfolding. Each day brought new opportunities for connection. Each task offered lessons in patience and understanding, and each quiet moment shared in the fading light of the desert sky reminded them that even in solitude, life could offer companionship, hope, and the possibility of renewal. The man had been working for weeks under the scorching sun, digging into the stubborn desert soil. Each day felt longer than the last, but he welcomed the routine, the rhythm, and the quiet that the work demanded. The well was more than a project now. It had become a challenge that pushed him to his limits, both physically and mentally. He had begun to realize that digging into the earth was also a way of digging into himself, uncovering emotions and memories he had long buried. The widow often watched from the edge of her property, her eyes calm yet observant. She did not speak much, yet her presence was felt in every gesture, every careful instruction, every small correction she offered. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a silent communication that grew with each passing day. Through shared labor, they had begun to trust each other, not through words but through effort, endurance, and patience. One afternoon, the man hit a particularly hard layer of rock. His spade barely moved it, and frustration began to build inside him. He wiped the sweat from his brow and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders. The widow approached quietly, carrying a small bottle of water and a cloth to wipe his hands. She did not scold him, nor did she speak words of encouragement. She simply handed him the water and sat a few feet away, letting him rest while her calm presence reminded him that he was not alone. As he drank, he began to talk, almost without realizing it. He spoke of the difficulties he had faced in his life, the mistakes he had made, and the losses he had endured. At first, the words were hesitant, fragmented, but as he continued, they became more honest and fluid. The widow listened, her eyes steady, her hands folded in her lap. She did not interrupt, did not judge, and did not offer advice. She simply listened, giving him the gift of being heard. In the days that followed, their conversations grew deeper. They spoke of their pasts, not as a way to dwell on sorrow, but as a way to understand each other and themselves. The man learned about the widow's husband, a kind man who had loved the land and his family deeply, and about the quiet strength she had discovered in herself after his passing. He listened with respect, realizing that her resilience was not born from pride, but from necessity, from the need to survive and thrive in a world that had not always been kind. The widow, in turn, began to learn more about the man. She discovered that his grief was different from hers, yet no less real. He had left a life behind because it had become unbearable, a life filled with regrets and unspoken sorrow. She sensed that his journey to the desert was not just for work, but for healing. In this quiet corner of the world, surrounded by the vast, silent land, they were both searching for something: understanding, peace, or perhaps a chance to begin again. The physical labor of the well continued to challenge them both. The ground was hard, the heat unrelenting, and progress slow. Yet with each spadeful of earth removed, they grew closer, their connection strengthening in ways that words alone could not achieve. They began to anticipate each other's needs and movements, learning to work in harmony without needing explicit communication. There was a rhythm to their efforts, a shared understanding that came from patience, trust, and the quiet bond formed through shared challenge. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the desert sky with shades of orange and pink, they paused their work to rest. The man looked at the widow, noticing the lines on her face that told stories of years of hardship and endurance. He realized that her strength was not something loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and unyielding. In that moment, he felt a deep respect for her, not just for her ability to survive, but for the grace and dignity with which she carried herself. The widow, observing him, saw a man who was learning to carry his own burdens with patience and humility. She recognized the effort he had put into the work, the determination in his eyes, and the honesty in his actions. Unlike many who had come and gone, he did not seek to impress her with words or stories. Instead, he demonstrated his character through labor, integrity, and a willingness to face hardship without complaint. In her eyes, this was more valuable than any spoken promise or empty gesture. As the days turned into weeks, small gestures of care began to emerge naturally between them. The widow would leave water and food for him at the edge of the worksite, simple acts that carried meaning far beyond their appearance. The man, in turn, began to look after her in subtle ways, clearing the path near her garden, repairing small sections of her property, and ensuring she never had to carry heavy loads alone. These gestures were not demanded or expected. They arose from mutual respect and a growing understanding of each other's lives and needs. The work on the well was nearing a critical stage. They had dug deep, encountering layers of soil and rock that tested their patience and endurance. The man had learned to read the land, to sense where water might lie hidden beneath the surface. The widow guided him carefully, her knowledge of the earth invaluable. Together they approached the task not as separate individuals, but as a team, united in purpose and effort. One particularly hot afternoon, as the sun bore down mercilessly, The man paused to rest. The widow joined him, handing him a piece of cloth soaked in cool water to place on his neck. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the wind rustling dry leaves and the occasional bird calling in the distance. In that quiet moment, words were unnecessary. Their shared labor and mutual understanding had created a connection that did not require explanation. It was during these quiet moments that the man began to confront his own emotions more openly. He reflected on the years he had spent running from life, avoiding pain and hiding from responsibility. The desert, with its vast silence and harsh realities, forced him to face himself. Every shovelful of earth he removed, every bead of sweat that fell, was a step toward understanding, acceptance, and inner strength. He realized that healing was not about forgetting the past, but about finding the courage to live with it and move forward. The widow, too, experienced a subtle change. She had lived much of her life in solitude, carrying grief quietly and guarding her heart carefully. Yet, in observing the man's sincerity, effort, and honesty, she felt a sense of ease she had not known in years. She recognized that the connection they shared was rare, built not on superficial attraction, but on respect, understanding, and shared experience. In him, she saw someone who valued the same principles she held dear: integrity, patience, and resilience. As the well grew deeper, their conversations became more meaningful. They shared stories of childhood, of dreams, and of the lessons life had taught them. These conversations were not always easy. Some memories were painful, some regrets lingered. Yet the act of sharing, of listening without judgment, created a bond that neither had expected but both welcomed. It was a quiet intimacy, rooted in trust and mutual recognition of each other's humanity. One evening, after a particularly long day, the man looked at the half-dug well and then at the widow. The desert sky was painted with the soft glow of twilight, and for a moment, the harshness of their labor seemed to fade. He realized that the well was more than a source of water. It was a symbol of their shared journey, of patience, resilience, and the quiet ways in which they had begun to depend on and care for each other. The widow, noticing his gaze, offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was a gesture that carried warmth, trust, and recognition. In that simple smile, the man felt a profound sense of connection, a realization that their bond had deepened beyond the physical labor they shared. They had begun to understand each other's hearts, to recognize the strength and vulnerability that lay beneath the surface. By the end of part 3, the man had not only grown stronger physically, but also emotionally. He had learned to face his own grief, to accept help, and to value the quiet, steadfast presence of another person. The widow, in turn, had begun to trust him, to see him as a companion in a world that had often felt isolating. Together, they had begun to dig deeper than the soil, uncovering a connection built on shared effort, respect, and understanding. The desert, once harsh and unforgiving, had become a place of discovery. It had revealed the resilience of the human spirit, the power of patience, and the quiet ways in which hearts could begin to heal. The well was not yet complete, and neither were they, but both had taken significant steps toward a future where hope, trust, and companionship could flourish. The days had grown longer, and the desert sun hotter than ever, but the man refused to give up. Each morning he rose before dawn, carrying his spade and tools toward the half-dug well. The soil was stubborn, heavy with layers of clay and rock that resisted every swing of his spade. Yet he persisted, driven by a purpose that had become larger than himself. This well was no longer just a task. It was a symbol of hope, patience, and the connection he had begun to feel with the widow. The widow observed him from the edge of her property, her eyes steady and calm. She had seen many workers come and go, but none like him. There was a quiet determination in the way he approached the labor, a patience that reflected more than just physical effort. She noticed how he paused sometimes to study the land, to feel the soil with his hands, and to listen to the subtle sounds of the desert. She realized that he was not just digging for water. He was learning to read the life around him, to understand the rhythm of the earth, and perhaps, unknowingly, to begin healing his own heart. Over the weeks, their interactions had grown deeper. Conversations were no longer just about work. They shared memories of their pasts, hopes for the future, and reflections on the struggles they had faced. The widow spoke of her husband, a man who had loved her deeply and taught her to respect the land. She spoke not with sadness alone, but with pride in what she had endured and learned. The man, in turn, shared fragments of his own story, of loss, mistakes, and the loneliness that had driven him to leave his old life behind. One day, as he dug, he struck a particularly hard layer of rock. The spade bounced against it with a hollow clang, and he paused, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He felt a wave of frustration, a reminder of all the times in life when effort seemed futile and results distant. The widow approached quietly, carrying a small jug of water. She handed it to him without speaking, her presence calm and steady, reminding him silently that he was not alone. He drank, feeling the cool water trickle down his throat, and took a deep breath. For a moment, he let himself lean on her support, acknowledging the fact that strength was not always a solitary act. In that quiet pause, he realized that the well was not only a task but a metaphor for life itself. Progress required persistence, patience, and often the quiet help of those who care. As the days turned into weeks, they both noticed subtle changes in each other. The widow's walls, built from years of solitude and grief, began to show cracks, not from weakness, but from trust forming where there had been none before. She began to smile more easily, to offer advice not only about the land but about life, and to share moments of quiet humor that lightened the burden of labor. The man, likewise, found himself opening up in ways he had never imagined. He spoke more freely of his fears and hopes, laughed quietly at her dry wit, and allowed himself to feel the first stirrings of connection and belonging in many years. One particularly hot afternoon, as the sun reached its peak and the desert shimmered with heat, the man felt the spade hit something different, a softer resistance beneath the layers of rock and dry soil. He paused, feeling a mixture of hope and disbelief. Could this be the water they had been seeking? He cleared the surrounding dirt carefully, his hands trembling slightly with anticipation. The widow watched closely, her eyes reflecting a quiet excitement she did not voice aloud. As he dug further, a small trickle of water began to emerge, followed by a steady flow. The earth had finally given up its hidden treasure. He fell to his knees, overwhelmed with relief and joy. The water shimmered in the sunlight, clear and life-giving, a reward for weeks of hard labor, patience, and perseverance. The widow approached and knelt beside him, both of them watching the water rise slowly from the earth. In that moment, the desert seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging their success and the bond that had formed through shared effort. Tears welled in the man's eyes, though he did not try to hide them. This was more than a physical victory. It was proof that persistence, patience, and faith could bring life even in the harshest conditions. The widow reached out quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of support and shared triumph. No words were necessary. The moment spoke volumes. They had faced the challenges of the land together, endured hardship, and now witnessed the reward of their efforts. After the initial excitement, they set about securing the well and ensuring the water could be collected safely. The man worked carefully, respecting both the resource and the traditions of the land. The widow guided him, her instructions precise, her knowledge of the earth invaluable. Each action was deliberate, a reminder that the labor was sacred, tied not only to survival but to respect for the life-giving force they had uncovered. As evening fell and the desert sky turned soft shades of purple and gold, they sat beside the flowing water. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with shared accomplishment and a quiet understanding of the journey they had undertaken together. The man looked at the widow, noticing the strength and grace in her posture, and felt a deep admiration that went beyond physical attraction. It was respect, gratitude, and the beginnings of something tender and human that neither had expected in such a harsh, lonely place. The widow, in turn, observed him with new eyes. She saw not just a man who had arrived with tools and determination, but someone who had faced his own challenges, who had shown resilience, patience, and honesty. She realized that the bond forming between them was rare, built on shared labor, mutual respect, and the acknowledgement of each other's strengths and vulnerabilities. It was a quiet intimacy, more profound than casual friendship, rooted in understanding and shared experience. In the days that followed, they continued to work together, ensuring the well was stable and that water could be accessed safely. Yet, the labor was no longer only about survival. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people trust and support each other. They shared stories as they worked, spoke of dreams, hopes, and lessons learned, and discovered humor and lightness even amid exhaustion. The well, which had once seemed like a mere necessity, had become a testament to human effort, resilience, and connection. One morning, as the man approached the well, he noticed the widow standing quietly at its edge, watching the water ripple in the sunlight. He realized that the well was more than water. It was a reflection of their journey together. They had dug deeper than the earth. They had dug into themselves, confronting fear, grief, and doubt. And in doing so, they had found something extraordinary: trust, companionship, and the beginnings of a bond that could sustain them both through future challenges. The discovery of water also brought a sense of renewal to the widow. She had survived years of hardship alone, relying on her strength and the land to sustain her. Yet, in sharing this moment with someone who understood effort, patience, and resilience, she experienced a new layer of hope. She recognized that life, even in the harshest conditions, could offer connection and joy when people allowed themselves to be vulnerable and open to trust. The man, too, felt a transformation within himself. He had arrived in the desert carrying grief, loss, and regret, unsure of what he would find. Yet, through shared labor, patience, and understanding, he had discovered a sense of purpose and belonging he had not experienced in years. The well was no longer just a physical structure. It was a symbol of what life could offer when people faced challenges with courage, honesty, and respect for one another. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the desert, they sat together by the flowing water. Their conversation was quiet, filled with reflections on the journey that had brought them here. They spoke of hardships faced, lessons learned, and the strength they had found in themselves and each other. In that moment, the desert no longer felt harsh or lonely. It felt alive, holding their stories, their efforts, and the beginnings of a bond that had grown naturally, patiently, and quietly through shared experience. By the end of Part 4, the man and the widow had reached a turning point. The well, once a symbol of challenge and labor, had become a symbol of hope, trust, and connection. Their relationship, built on shared effort, patience, and respect, had deepened into something meaningful and enduring. The desert, which had once seemed empty and unforgiving, had become a space of growth, understanding, and the promise of renewal. The well had become more than just a source of water. It was a symbol of perseverance, trust, and connection. The man and the widow had worked side by side for weeks, enduring heat, fatigue, and the stubborn soil, but they had emerged stronger, both in body and spirit. The water flowed freely now, shimmering in the sunlight, a quiet reward for their patience and effort. As they looked at it together, both of them felt a sense of fulfillment that went far beyond the physical. The man had changed in ways he had not anticipated. When he first arrived, he had been searching for a place to hide from his past, a way to escape the mistakes and losses that haunted him. But in the desert, through labor, silence, and quiet observation, he had found more than refuge. He had found purpose. Each spade of earth he had removed had taught him patience. Each moment spent listening to the widow's calm guidance had taught him respect. Each drop of sweat had reminded him of resilience. The desert had forced him to confront himself, and in doing so, he had begun to heal. The widow, too, felt a quiet transformation. She had lived most of her life alone, carrying grief and hardship without complaint. Yet, in sharing this journey with someone who understood effort and honesty, she had discovered a renewed sense of hope. She had learned that life could offer companionship, trust, and even joy, even in the harshest of places. The man's presence was not just a help in labor. It was a reminder that shared effort could build something far greater than the sum of its parts. In the days following the completion of the well, they settled into a new rhythm. The man continued to work on minor improvements to the land and the homestead, always careful to respect the widow's space and her ways. She, in turn, offered guidance, sharing her deep knowledge of the land and its rhythms. Their relationship had grown quietly, naturally, and without pressure. It was no longer just about the well or survival. It was about understanding, trust, and the beginnings of a shared life shaped by respect and care. One morning, the man rose early to check the well. The sun was just beginning to paint the desert in soft shades of gold and orange. As he approached the water, he noticed the widow tending to her small garden. The sight was familiar, comforting, and full of quiet beauty. He paused for a moment, taking in the calm scene, and realized how much he had come to value these simple, daily routines. The rhythm of labor, the quiet presence of another person, and the subtle joys that had once seemed insignificant but now felt essential. He approached her, and they spoke for the first time without the interruption of work. Their conversation was easy, flowing naturally as they discussed plans for the land, the garden, and small improvements to the well. Laughter appeared more freely now, a sign that trust and comfort had grown between them. The widow's eyes sparkled with quiet amusement at his careful observations and tentative suggestions, and he smiled at her gentle teasing. It was a moment of normalcy, simple yet profound, that marked a shift from laborers to companions, from strangers to partners in life. As the days passed, the man began to understand the depth of the connection they shared. It was built not on instant attraction, but on patience, effort, and the willingness to face life's hardships together. Every challenge they had encountered, the stubborn soil, the relentless heat, the moments of doubt and frustration, had strengthened their bond. They had learned to rely on each other, to respect each other's strength and vulnerabilities, and to appreciate the quiet ways in which care and trust could be expressed. The widow, observing him, realized that she had found in him a partner who understood the value of effort, honesty, and patience. He did not seek to impress her with words or grand gestures. Instead, he demonstrated his character through consistent actions, humility, and a willingness to learn and adapt. She saw in him a man who could face the challenges of life with integrity, and in that recognition, she felt a sense of hope for the future she had not known in years. One afternoon, as they sat together by the flowing water, the man spoke of his plans. He expressed his desire to stay, not only to maintain the well and the land, but also because he had found a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. The widow listened, her expression thoughtful, and then she nodded. She acknowledged the effort, patience, and trust that had brought them to this moment. It was a quiet, profound agreement that their lives would continue intertwined, shaped by shared experience, mutual respect, and the understanding that true connection grows slowly, steadily, and with care. The desert, once vast and empty, now felt alive. Each sunrise brought a sense of possibility, and each sunset offered reflection and gratitude. The well, which had been a source of struggle, now provided water, sustenance, and a reminder of what could be achieved through perseverance. But more importantly, It symbolized the connection between two people who had endured hardship, confronted grief, and discovered companionship in a place where both had expected only isolation. The man and the widow continued to work together on small projects around the property, but the nature of their efforts had shifted. They were no longer just laboring for survival. They were building a life, one small improvement at a time. They planted new crops, repaired fences, and tended to the garden with care. Each task was an opportunity to collaborate, to share knowledge, and to strengthen the bond that had grown between them. The rhythm of daily life, once lonely and monotonous, had become meaningful and fulfilling. As the seasons changed, the man and the widow grew closer. They shared stories of their pasts, laughed at small moments of humor, and supported each other in ways that required neither words nor explanation. Their connection was built on understanding, respect, and the quiet recognition of each other's strength. In each other, they had found someone who could face life's challenges with courage and patience, someone who understood the value of effort, honesty, and care. The well remained a central part of their lives, a reminder of the journey they had undertaken together. Each time they drew water, they were reminded of the effort, patience, and trust that had made it possible. It was a tangible symbol of their growth, both as individuals and as companions. The desert, once harsh and unforgiving, had become a space of renewal, connection, and hope. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of purple and gold, the man and the widow sat by the flowing water. They watched the shadows stretch across the desert, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. They had faced physical and emotional challenges, confronted grief and loneliness, and discovered the quiet power of trust, patience, and shared effort. In that moment, they understood that life's greatest rewards often come not from immediate success, but from perseverance, understanding, and the willingness to open one's heart. The man reflected on how far he had come. He had arrived in the desert seeking refuge from his past, unsure of what he would find. Instead, he had discovered purpose, connection, and a sense of belonging he had never known. The widow had shown him the value of patience, resilience, and quiet strength. Together, they had built not only a well but also a foundation for a life filled with trust, companionship, and hope. The widow, too, recognized the transformation within herself. She had lived much of her life alone, carrying grief and hardship with quiet dignity. Yet in sharing this journey with someone who understood effort, honesty, and patience, she had discovered a renewed sense of hope. She realized that life, even in its harshest moments, could offer connection, understanding, and the possibility of happiness when people allowed themselves to trust and care for one another. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, they sat together in comfortable silence. The desert, once intimidating and empty, now felt alive and full of promise. The well continued to flow, providing water, sustenance, and a reminder of the effort and patience that had made it possible. But the greater gift was the bond between the man and the widow, a connection forged through shared labor, trust, and the willingness to face life's challenges together. In the months that followed, they continued to live and work side by side. Their days were filled with meaningful labor, shared stories, and quiet moments of companionship. They learned to anticipate each other's needs, to support one another without expectation, and to value the simple joys of life in the desert. Their connection, built over time, had become a source of strength, comfort, and hope, demonstrating that even in the harshest conditions, human hearts could find understanding, care, and love. By the end of their journey, the man and the widow had not only completed a well, but had also built a life together, one rooted in trust, respect, and shared experience. They had discovered that true connection is nurtured through patience, honesty, and mutual effort. The desert, which had once seemed lonely and unforgiving, had become a place of renewal, growth, and the quiet magic of human resilience. The story ended not with grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but with simple, enduring truths that life's challenges can be overcome through perseverance, that trust and care are built slowly but last a lifetime, and that the human heart, when open, can find connection and hope even in the most unlikely places. The man and the widow had discovered these truths together, their lives forever changed by the well, the desert, and the bond that had grown between them.